Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Bariatric Care, the podcast. I'm actually going to be picking up where we left off last week. And last week was an amazing interview with Diane Petrella. And Diane is a therapist of over 40 years. She's worked with kids, she's worked with adults. And what she has found in her work is that so many people who are emotional eaters have been traumatized as children. Now, before you click this off and say, well, that's not me, I've never been traumatized, hold tight, because trauma comes in various forms and it's across a continuum. It can be being bullied at school. And because our audience is a group of people who have struggled with the disease of obesity, a lot of you have experienced trauma in relation to your disease. It could have been by caregivers, it could have been by medical professionals, it could have been by people at school, at home, in the extended family. So hang with me because I really want you to get this information. This topic of emotional eating is so prevalent in the population of people who have bariatric surgery and people who struggle with weight issues in general. And it's not just overweight. Emotional eaters can be of any size. There are no limits. Emotional eating is when you eat in response to feelings that make you uncomfortable. So if that is you, and that includes boredom, by the way, if you're one of those people who does really, really well during the day and then at night you're watching TV and you kind of let go and you're like, oh, I got to have the snacks, and you start eating quite a bit of, you consume quite a few calories in the evening, well, maybe it's out of boredom, but that boredom could be standing in for or masking some other emotions. So hang with me. I'm going to do a deep dive into this book, and we are going to go through it very, very thoroughly because I think this information is so absolutely critical. So most of what I share with you is going to come from the author, Diane Petrella. Again, the name of the book, of course, will be linked in the notes, is Healing Emotional Eating for Trauma Survivors. If I stray from Diane's work, I will say, and here's what I think, and this is what I would like to add, but let's go ahead and get started. And Diane goes all the way back to the beginning of a person's life when she talks about that the experience of food, the experience of love actually begins with food, because when babies are, fed, they're held, they're nurtured, there's a lot of eye contact. It's usually a very good experience if you've got nurturing parents or nurturing caregivers. And food, as you know, in your adult life often triggers a lot of nostalgic memories. So it could be you remember cooking. This is Connie talking. You could be remember cooking with grandma, or you can remember special outings with an older sibling who meant a lot to you, and you would go get a treat, or it was the only time your parents spent any time alone with you, as if they took you out to eat, whatever it might have been. But food often has a lot of memories attached to it that belong to our childhood. And in this way, whether it's nurture when you're being fed as a baby, or if there's a lot of emotional memories associated with food, Diane says food is emotional. And when food, she says, is kind of intertwined or woven with the parent's loving attention, you're getting fed, you're getting the smiles, you're getting the coos, mommy loves you, you're getting the snuggles, then that child absorbs the love. And there's a connection between the food and the feeling of warmth and nurturing and safety. So food is extra, but it pairs with the love between the parent that's already there. But if you don't have the emotional support, food sometimes, now listen to this is important because it can go way, way back and you might not even have awareness of this. But Diane says without emotional support, food can become a replacement for love or for a connection that may be absent. All right, this is Connie talking. Think about if you came home from school, there was nobody home with you for hours, you were maybe a little nervous to be alone, you went and got some snacks, you sat in front of the TV, and food became your companion. It's a love, friendship, relationship, a form of love. So If you don't have emotional support or nurturing in your life on a consistent basis, then food, Diane says, can become a replacement for love, or it can become a sort of connection that's not actually there in your life. And this will become important later on in your life when you're looking for a connection and what you go to is food, because somewhere in your brain, you've made that connection between the two. So, nurturing experiences, kids. This comes from Diane's book. We all need nurturing, and it can come from siblings or parents or grandparents or neighborhood friends. Nurturing experiences always add something essential that a child needs. It's like currency, she says, into a child's self-worth bank. Keep that in mind because kids need, and if you take the Gain While You Lose class, I go over what people need as they're growing up to become a healthy, stable adult. And the research that I use talks about how people need heavy doses over long periods of time of things like acceptance, nurturing, affirmation, words of encouragement, all those love language kinds of things. So if you're a child and your world is kind of void of that in some ways, then food can become a replacement for that. So in her book, Diane says when a child feels sad or they're anxious or in any way feels unsafe and they don't get that comforting reassurance that they need from the adults in their lives or their caregivers, they may turn to food for their, check this out, emotional survival. Emotional survival. Those are important words. And she says it's really important to understand that for some people, the use of food, especially as a young person, is rooted in self-protection. It's like I need something from somewhere. And if the adults in your life aren't available, maybe you've got a parent that's sick and can't take care of you because they're sick and they're an only parent. Well, you may turn to food to get something that you're not getting elsewhere. Or maybe you have a single parent and they're working 2 or 3 jobs to support you. They're not doing anything bad or wrong, but you're left alone in need of something that they're not giving you out of necessity. So it's not a blaming or a shaming thing, and this is coming from me. This is not all in Diane's book, but I go over it in the Gain While You Lose class. But when humans hurt, and this is a quote from Diane's book, when humans hurt, they need relief. We find ways to get relief. Often adults, they're going to find a mood-altering substance, or they're going to spend too much money, or they're going to, be on the phone for hours just to kind of numb themselves. But when humans hurt, they need relief. And if you're a kid and you don't have a lot of relief from the bullying at school or from the constant fighting between your parents and you're trying to get out of the line of fire, or a sick sibling who needs all the attention, they're going to find something to do. And if food is what they find to get that relief that they need, it's a resourceful thing to do. So now this is Connie again. You've often heard me talk about going to AA meetings and hearing people say, I'm a grateful recovering addict or a grateful recovering alcoholic. And at first when I was going to the meetings, I was like, what are they talking about? What are they so grateful for? Well, I'm grateful, A, that I had something to help me survive through the tough times. Not a healthy choice for sure. But when I started drinking, when I was using that pain medication to numb myself, I needed it because I didn't have other skills. And when I went to treatment and gave up the substances, that's when I needed to learn the skills. That's why when I, Connie, talk about when a person has weight loss surgery or loses a lot of weight, sometimes, and this is not for everyone, but a lot of people who have used food for an emotional comfort or something to kind of relax or help the emotions go away, the uncomfortable emotions go away, they need to learn healthier skills or some healthy coping tools in lieu of the food. That's why there's a lot of transfer addiction after surgery, because we're giving up our comforter in the food and we don't know the skills, so a lot of people will turn to something else. So that's why I needed all the aftercare services I could attend, including therapy and classes after I went through treatment. And that's why I do Berry Aftercare. So here we are. We use food to survive sometimes emotionally as a kid. And then it becomes a habit, and that's what you know to do as an adult. So it's your coping skill. So if food is a coping skill for you in your adult life, if food is something you use to help numb painful emotions, then even if you don't have trauma in your background or you think you don't, you need to listen to the information in this book, because what it's going to do is give you some really important skills to work through and a lot of affirmation about the emotional eating. Now, Diane writes in her book, and I have this in bold in my notes, and this is not new information to me. It may be new information to you. If you have taken my Gain While You Lose class, this will have been pounded into your head. And if you haven't taken the class, get on my website and sign up, because we're starting again soon. But here's what Diane writes. Until you heal the root cause of your pain, that may be being bullied about your weight. That may be being left home alone for hours on end. That may be having had a parent who, there was a divorce and one parent left your life and never returned. It may be a beloved sibling going off to college and nobody helped you deal with that. It may be the loss of a pet that you never who knows? But until you heal the root cause of the pain and the reason you're turning to something outside to find comfort, Diane says it's hard to free yourself from the ways some substances and behaviors numb that pain. So if you're an emotional eater, if you've suffered with any kind of addiction, or if you are struggling with any kind of addictive behaviors, it's an indication. And there are numerous professionals and researchers, and you can look it up in 1,000 different places who say the same thing. And I'm going to repeat it. Until you heal the root cause of your pain. What's this pain about? It's hard to free yourself from the ways some substances and behaviors numb that pain. So until you heal whatever it is you need to heal from, then you're going to continue to look for something externally to numb that pain. Diane says, when using food, if you're stressed, you need to give some consideration, and I mentioned this just a minute ago, that it may have been a self-protective move. So don't get down on yourself. If you're an emotional eater, it's like this started somewhere. Maybe it was a protection for me, and maybe I need to be grateful that I had it. It doesn't serve me well in my adult life, but at the time I needed it, the food felt very grounding. It was soothing. It was comforting. And maybe it still is, but it's not serving you well in your life today. So we need to learn something new. Next in her book, Healing Emotional Pain for Trauma Survivors, Diane goes into this explanation of how early trauma affects the brain. And what I want you to think about here is when I talk about trauma, again, a lot of people think of being physically abused or being sexually abused. And yes, those are forms of trauma. But trauma can be a lot of things. Like I said, if you have a parent that maybe abandoned you when you were a child, maybe through death or divorce, or they just disappeared, that's a form of trauma for a child. Trauma for a child could be when maybe a classmate dies and nobody helps explain what happened. Or when you lose a beloved pet and people are like, oh, get over it, it's just a pet. Or if you went to school day after day after day and people called you names, that is traumatizing, my friend. So anything that causes a lot of emotional pain and is not just a one-time experience, but you feel that pain for a long time, like with losses, that's trauma. And how trauma affects a child's brain is very profound. All of our experiences as kids, whether they're positive or not positive, influence our brain development. And this is from Diane's book. She says when a child or a teenager suffers chronic trauma or fear. So let's say you live in a house where there's a lot of drug use going on and you're afraid that there's going to be a raid or a bust all the time. Or maybe you're living in a household where the parents are fighting a lot. Or maybe you're afraid because You have a parent who has a terminal illness and they're declining. Maybe you live with a lot of trauma, a lot of fear, especially if it's within your home. The brain's normal reaction to any kind of threat, you've heard of this, and Diane talked a lot about it last time, is the fight, flight, or freeze response. And this takes place in a part of your brain called the amygdala. So if you're under stress for a long time, then you're going to become hypersensitive to it. It's like you're always on alert. You're looking for that other shoe to drop. You're very aware of other people's moods as an adult. You're very sensitive to changes in the emotional temperature of the room because you're hypersensitive. You had to be as a kid. You needed to know when to run off to your room and hide. You needed to know when to keep your mouth shut and stay out of the line of fire. I mean, kids develop these skills, but it's because they're on hyper alert all of the time if they've lived with chronic stress. If you're at school and you've been bullied and you're being bullied, you got to keep your eyes open and know when that next person's coming, or steel yourself for the next negative comment. And then Diane mentioned a fourth stress response called fawning, which she talks about later. And I love this because a lot of people describe themselves to me as people pleasers. If you're a people pleaser, if you cannot stand conflict because you want everybody to be happy, if you just want to keep the peace at all costs, it may be that your response to stress as a kid was to try to make everybody happy. This is one of the things that I did. I remember very distinctly, saying to my mom, would you like me to help you with the laundry? Would you like me to help you fold the clothes? Would you like me to? I wanted to make her happy, to keep her calm so she wouldn't be hysterical. When my dad was around, who had a really bad temper, I'd be like, Dad, do you want me to run and get your cigarettes? I would ask him, do you want me to go fetch you a beer? I just wanted peace. So that's a fawning experience because I don't want any more stress. I don't want things to blow up around here. So fight. I'm going to get in there and fight. And as kids, we don't often have the opportunity to do that because what are you going to do? Fight with your parent when you're 4 years old? No, you're going to shut up so you don't get hit again. Or, if your parents are in the middle of a big heated fight, you don't want to get in the middle of that if you're a young child. A lot of kids when they get older will, but as a young child, you're just terrified and fearful. So this overactive amygdala really makes you super sensitive to stress. Now, if food was a source of comfort for you, or if you learned that food would make you feel better, guess what you've just done? You've developed a connection, a correlation between stress and if I eat, I feel better. So whatever kinds of unsettled feelings that you have in your body as a child, Diane explains it as, you become this word dysregulated is big in the psychological literature, but when you're very sensitive to stress, you become dysregulated. You don't feel stable. You don't feel grounded. You feel overwhelmed. You don't know what to do with these emotions in your body because you haven't been taught. They're too big for your brain as a kid. You don't know what to do with these. So you might find yourself, your heart's racing really fast, or your breathing is really shallow. When you get really anxious, you get a knot in your stomach. So, you have this anxiety, you have this fear, or you may just shut down and feel nothing. You're detached. It's like, I am a rock, I am an island, and a rock feels no pain, like the Simon and Garfunkel song. So your brain becomes conditioned to be alert for danger. So you may be an adult now, and even low levels of stress, your boss gets irritated at work, and in your mind, this file cabinet, this is me talking, this is not in the book, but there's a file cabinet that opens, and you remember what it was like when Dad's voice started to get raised, or he got agitated, and all of a sudden, you're feeling like that kid again, but you're in your office. What's the best thing to do? Reach for that candy bar in that drawer. So we make these connections very subconsciously. We develop the connection between food and relief, oftentimes very young. And we don't make that connection as adult. All we know is this makes me feel better. This makes me feel better. Because when you're feeling those big, intense emotions, you just want relief and you want it fast. So as a kid, you don't get to drive to the liquor store. You don't get to drive yourself to the fast food place, but you can run to the pantry, or you can run down the street and go to the dime store or, the convenience store. So you want food fast if that's your go-to for relief. It's very readily available for most people. There are food deprivation scenarios that are real, but for most people, food was an easy access. So if food deprivation was real for you, that's a whole different topic, and it is awful. But if food was readily available and that's what you used for comfort, that's who this book is for. Because food helps you with that overwhelm. It eases the emotion. And especially if you're in survival mode, which even if you don't feel like you're in survival mode as an adult, you've got that irritability, that tension, that stress going on in your body. And it's linked to what felt like survival mode as a kid without your even being aware of it. And so a lot of times that's why people are like, well, it seems like I don't have any control over this, because these impulses will override your logic. And that does happen. So give yourself a break on that, because sometimes even if you're working on these skills and you feel like you've got the knowledge, you give into it time and time again. That's because there are these things that happen without our awareness that can sometimes seem to really override our logical senses, even as an adult. Because in her book, Diane says, if you feel in danger, you run, and sometimes you run to food. So there you go. So one of the things that you want to learn to do, and this also is from Diane, noticing these sensations, the racing heart or the clenched jaw or the rapid breathing, is a type of awareness called interoceptive awareness. You don't need to know that, but what you need to know, this is your body communicating to you. You're breathing shallow, your heart's racing, you got tingling in your arms, you're just tense and uncomfortable. That's your body saying, something's off. I'm not feeling grounded. There's a level of anxiety, there's a level of fear here. And being aware of this is one of the steps toward helping you heal. But, sometimes we become detached from these emotions and we're not even aware. It's like these things are going on and it's so normal for us. And that includes the sense of fullness or hunger. And so sometimes, and this is in the book, Diane talks about, we want to become aware of what's going on with our body, because one of the things you can do is when you're aware of it, you can take that time out and you can learn to find ways to calm yourself, these healthy coping skills for stress and frustration and trauma and anxiety and fear without turning to food. And you can also become more aware of whether you're full or whether you're hungry. So a lot of these things we can access as adults when we couldn't as kids. So Diane talks about these unsettling emotions, especially for children. They stay stored in the body. Now, here's what happens. This is me talking. I do these pre-surgical evaluations for surgery, and I always ask people about childhood trauma, if they grew up in a, anxiety-ridden household, if there was alcoholism, if there was, if a kid was home alone a lot, if there was drug addiction going on in the home, if parents were fighting a lot, any kind of stress. Was there any kind of physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, that kind of thing? And more times than not, people will say, well, yeah, this or that happened, but it happened in the past and I'm over it. Okay. Now, we want to believe we're over it. And I believe that when people say that, they believe it, but it doesn't make it true. Because even though your body has aged and you have moved on to a different stage in your life, these suppressed and repressed memories stay stored in your body, in your physiological system. And a lot of people don't believe this, or don't buy into this, and don't get it. But in the last several years with the book, The Body Knows the Score, by Bessel van der Kolk, or Gabor Mate's book, When the Body Says No. And there's all kinds of these books that showing the research that these are our emotional systems hold on to these memories. And that is why when you're somewhere and maybe you hear the sound of a woman's voice and it sounds like your grandmother who used to beat the snot out of you, you find yourself tense all of a sudden. Or you see the kid who in 4th grade was the biggest bully of them all and called you the worst names of them all. And all of a sudden you want to shrink and run away and hide. It's because even though you're in an adult-sized body now and you have an adult-sized brain, your body remembers what it felt like to be in those experiences. And so I'm just going to ask you to trust the professionals on this and the number of researchers that have shown over and over and over again. It's like file cabinets that are open and closing all day long in your brain that have nothing to do with the present necessarily, but something in the present will remind you of something in the past. So maybe, your boss says something to you and you're like irritated. It's like, gosh, it feels like my boss is always picking on me. But you have a history of a parent always picking on you and finding fault with everything. Now you're reacting not just to the boss's comment, but to the constant criticism of your parent. And so maybe you overreact. So that is why a lot of times we overreact, because some file drawer in our brain somewhere that we're not even aware of has opened, and you've got all these things rushing out at you to combine with what's happening in the present, and you're reacting not as a 30, 40, or 50-year-old human being adult, but you have the reaction of a 10-year-old child. So if you think about it, you can see when other people overreact. Are you aware of when you overreact? A lot of people will say, and I hear this a lot from patients that I work with, and Diane wrote this down too. She says, sometimes simply having nothing to do may trigger feelings of vulnerability and overwhelm. She's talking about when you're bored or at night when things quiet down. And she writes in her book, when it gets quiet on the outside, it can get real noisy on the inside. In other words, when everybody's in bed and you can wind down a little bit, if it's quiet and you're sitting alone with yourself, your brain starts. And then you're not, you get these unpleasant thoughts and these unpleasant emotions that just kind of bubble up out of you. So a lot of people don't want to have any downtime with themselves. They want to busy every minute. They're going to have the TV on, they're going to have the radio on, they're going to be reading and watching the TV and scrolling on their phone at the same time. Anything to stay away from yourself. And that's a lot of times when it gets quiet, you start munching. Sound familiar? It might. All right. Diane writes in the book, noticing these things that's happening in your body, it can feel overwhelming. So a lot of people will tell me, this is me talking. I've done polls online and I've said, what is one thing that worries you or upsets you about giving up food? And people will say emotions. The vast majority of what people are worried about is what they're going to feel. So that says to me a lot of people are using food for emotional comfort. So if that is you, if you, when you're left alone with your own devices, start having upsetting thoughts or angry thoughts or negative self-talk, or you get scared, or, you confuse your fullness and your hunger signals, it can trigger this emotional eating because you're out of sorts within yourself. So there you go. Sometimes people don't know the difference between if I'm hungry or if I'm scared because they're so unaware of the different signals in their bodies, so that it can be hard to know the difference. So let's talk about, and Diane talks about, perhaps you've experienced traumatic memories as emotional eating triggers. Or maybe you're consciously aware when it's happening, you grab something to eat and it can be an automatic response. So that you go to the holiday thing and the whole family's there and you have good resolve going in that you're going to stick to your eating plan, but you find yourself stuffing things in your face all the time, and maybe it's because the cousin that bullied you, or the uncle who sexually abused you, or whatever it is, they're there, and their presence, or just the feelings in that home, or some of the people in the family trigger these intense emotions, and this can override your logic. So you don't want to beat up on yourself when these things happen. You want to learn from them afterwards. So we use our experiences to learn. And I love this. And here's the compassion that Diane says, that Diane has. And I love this. And I told her, I said, you're a lot more compassionate than I am when it comes to working with people. She says, it's possible that you might not be aware of what's going on within you, and you grab something to eat because it's an automatic habit that your mind uses to keep you emotionally safe. She said, either way, you feel destabilized if you don't turn to food, and it's possible that these memories are overwhelming you. She says, listen to this. It's okay to use food when you don't feel or don't see any other way to feel safe. I'm going to read that again. It's okay to use food when you don't see any other way to feel safe. Food has been your sanctuary for a reason. Now, don't misinterpret that to mean, I can go out and eat whatever I want, whenever I want. That's not what she's saying. But she's like, if you're in a situation and you just are so overwhelmed and don't know what to do, it's okay if you turn to food. It's helped you for a long, long time, and you don't need to beat yourself up about it. She says, when you do turn to food, just do your best to eat consciously. For example, she says, you could say, I'm eating because I feel scared, and nothing else is helping right now. So it's not like, don't ever emotionally eat again. Shame on you. No, you don't need to beat yourself up. Sometimes you're at a complete loss. So if you say, I don't know what else to do right now, this feels like the only thing that I can think of or know to do right now, then she says, make it about a decision. I'm eating because I feel scared, anxious, overwhelmed, alone, afraid, and nothing else is helping right now. I love that. It's giving yourself permission and not needing to beat yourself up. This isn't to be used as an excuse, but sometimes it's going to happen. She says eating a conscious choice can help reduce its power. So it's like, you don't have to, oh my God, I can't believe I gave into that again. I'm the worst person ever. No, I chose to do this because it didn't feel like I had I didn't know what to do. And then you made it a choice, and you can go, okay, that's all right. So she says, a lot of people will ask, well, can I heal from emotional eating if I have a history of trauma? Absolutely, you can. Absolutely, you can. And part of that is going to be learning to feel safe in your body by learning other ways to calm yourself and to ground yourself. People regain, and they say, because of stress or because life happened, which translates into stress. So if you learn to deal with stress in healthier ways, you can at least reduce the number of emotional eating incidences. And when we talked in our interview, she said, you may go from eating emotionally 80% of the time and reduce it to 60, and then later reduce it to 70 and 40, and really reduce the number of times you give in to eating for emotional reasons. And that is huge progress. So I love that approach. It's not the all or nothing. And a lot of us struggle with that. Then she talks about ways to calm the body and learn to get in touch with your emotions. And in the Gain While You Lose class, I talk a lot about when you're really at a heightened state of emotion. And I've mentioned it several times already today. It's hard to make rational, conscious decisions, but that's what we have to learn to do. So before we can draw on our logic, we have to calm the emotion. We have to calm this stress, and learning some skills to do that are very, very beneficial. And I'm not going to go into detail about those, but a lot of it is learning to breathe and calm, because that helps regulate your system. And it's our system that gets out of whack. We got too much anxiety, too much stress, too much worry, too much fear going on, and we have to calm it. So the stress response is the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. We want to calm that down so we can say, wait a minute, I'm not a child anymore. I'm not in that situation. That person can no longer hurt me. These people, if their words don't have to affect me like they did when I was in the 4th grade. But we have to get our body calmed, and we do that by calming ourselves, by breathing, by slowing ourselves down. That's why these breathing techniques that all the therapists try to teach you are so vital. Because if you're 1,000% revved up, you can't draw on those. You have to take time. This is a long process. You have to learn these skills. You have to practice these skills, and it's a lifetime thing. I still sometimes, 35 years into my own recovery from all the addictions, food, alcohol, pills, I still overreact sometimes. I still get that intense emotional surge that doesn't come from the moment in the present. It's a combination of what I'm angry about now and the 7,000 things I didn't have a voice to confront as a child. So it's a process. You have to learn it. Coping with these painful feelings, Diane says, it's hard, if not impossible, to do when the physiological effects of trauma get triggered in your body. That's why sometimes you feel like you don't have a choice. It's like I just turned to food. I couldn't even think about it. We're going to learn to be compassionate, not beat yourself up with that kind of stuff, because it's not going to help you. This whole process takes tremendous amounts of patience. You're not likely going to learn this on your own. That's why you need a professional. And while I'm on it, I'm going to take a little segue here, because there are a lot of programs in the bariatric community who are espousing the use of mental health coaches. And life coaches can be very, very good. Don't get me wrong. I am all about it. If they are extremely trained, if they've had years and years of practice, if they've had mentoring and guidance. But a mental health coach is not a licensed professional. A mental health coach may have no education, formal education, in the ways of the psychological mind. A professional in the world of mental health has had a lot of education and experience. They have been supervised for hours and hours and hours on end. I had, 4 years of undergraduate degree, 2 years of a master's degree, and an additional 3 years of college courses as for my PhD, which is a total of 9 years of college. A coach may or may not have any college. And again, it's not to say that all coaches don't have something of value. Many of them are amazing. But that is not a substitute for working with a professional when it comes to something like dealing with trauma in your past. So please don't confuse the two. I just have to say that because it irritates me when I know the level of training that I have had, the amount of experience I've had, and people are promoting programs where they have mental health coaches. It's not the same quality of care. Okay, that's it for that. Back to the book. Okay, so I'm going to read what Diane wrote here. Learning to feel and be with your feelings. And that's what we need to do in order not to eat in response to them, in order not to be a stress eater, in order not to be an emotional eater. We got to get in touch with these feelings and learn to deal with those. But she says, think of your feelings as little children calling for your attention. I love this, right? Think of these feelings. You've seen the movies Inside Out. Those are great movies to understand how important your feelings are. These feelings need to be heard. It's like when you're having a fit on the inside, pay attention and go, like if it's a child, and go, you know what? I hear you. You're scared. I, your adult self, am here to be with you. I hear you. You're angry. Tell me what you're angry about. In other words, talk to these emotions as though they're little children and give them what a little child would actually need. She says they need to be heard, they need to be soothed, and they need to be comforted, just like you probably did as a child, and maybe there was nobody there, and that's why you used food in the first place. The feelings aren't to be pushed aside, she says, as if they and you don't matter. Because as a child, if you weren't tended to, if your emotions weren't tended to, if you were told, don't cry or I'll give you something to cry about, if you were told, get over it, if you're told you're overly emotional, you're just being too much, you feel shut aside, you feel pushed aside, you feel like you don't matter. Your feelings do matter, and by God, so do you. Because the feelings are there as your teacher. So she says, for example, if you've got this anger that you weren't able to express, it may be teaching you to speak up for yourself. And let me tell you, how many of you find it difficult to speak up for yourself? You may feel resentment and you need maybe to set a boundary, but how many of you struggle to set boundaries? Sadness may be guiding you to grieve the loss of something. Maybe you never had anybody hold your hand while you cried, or held you in a hug while you cried. So you shut those feelings down with food. And then when you do that as an adult, you're denying yourself, not intentionally, but unintentionally, you're denying yourself the opportunity to grow, to heal from those old wounds, and to deal with life, with whatever's going on around you without the use of food. So we have to learn to release the trauma. You've probably heard the 12-step expression, you're only as sick as the secrets you keep. I've heard a lot of secrets from people in my therapy sessions that they felt too afraid or ashamed or embarrassed or icky about to share before. And let me tell you, the releasing of those secrets sets you free. Now, there's a difference between keeping something private and keeping a secret. So children who are sexually abused often keep it a secret. Versus, you might have confided a secret in your best friend. That's keeping something private. It's not necessarily a dirty little secret, right? But keeping things that cause you tremendous pain inside of you will continue to make you sick. A lot of illnesses are shown to be related to unexpressed emotion. It is true. And using food or alcohol or drugs or a lot of those things are related to not knowing how to, having had the experience of sharing emotions. We have to learn to do that. Because when we keep things inside of us that were embarrassing or caused us pain, it produces shame. And that shame, and Diane talks about this in the book, is the feeling that I'm not okay. Something's wrong with me. Something's wrong with me. So when people hold on to secrets about trauma that they've experienced, it's going to take an emotional toll, and it's going to take a physical toll on their bodies, because I'm afraid to talk about things in my adult life. I'm afraid to set boundaries. I'm afraid to say no to people. I'm afraid to have a difficult conversation because I never had the opportunity, the experience to learn how to do it as a child. I had to keep things in. And when I keep things in, it makes your body and your mind sick. Depression, anxiety, overeating, overdrinking, any kind of addiction. So if you're carrying shameful secrets, it's important that you find somebody to talk about. Here's what Diane writes in her book. Child abuse is twofold. It's the traumatic experience itself, coupled with the emotional heaviness of not expressing the feelings about it. So now we got two problems, right? Whatever happened to you as a child, physical abuse, sexual abuse, bullying, whatever. That, and then not getting the feelings about it out. This results in unprocessed fear that lives in your body and your mind. And that's why you become a person who is easily triggered, whose emotions are dysregulated. You may be an overreactor, or you may have completely shut down. So, some people hold on to these traumatic secrets for decades. It can make you sick physically, emotionally, and spiritually. And that's from the book and 1,000 other sources. She says the inner tension that comes from not processing these traumatic secrets may be why you're experiencing anxiety, maybe why you're experiencing sadness, depression, and emptiness that can trigger this emotional eating. So, emotional intimacy is what we're looking for. And I'm not talking sex. I'm talking about confidence. I'm talking about sharing confidences with somebody. I'm talking about telling somebody my secrets. I'm saying, this happened to me and I feel sick about it. When I was a child, I was not able to share my feelings, or I was told to shut up, or I'd be hit, or I'd be sent to my room, or I was shut down. Now I don't know how to speak my truth because I'm afraid to. So self-disclosure, talking to somebody, and that's why this takes a professional. This takes a professional to help you get rid of these things, to feel safe enough to do it. And we share these things, and some of the barriers start to leave. And that leaves us able to start to process these things and to hear reassuring things that we needed to hear as children, and be able to start telling ourselves these really comforting things that nobody told us as kids. So I would really find a professional if you're carrying around a lot of baggage or trauma or unexpressed things. So talking about things, learning to calm yourself with the breathing, all kinds of relaxation skills are really, really, really important to learn. Now, here's the other part of this. So maybe the food was a safe thing for you to do. It helped you survive a really difficult time in your life. And now it's become a habit. Now we got the emotional crap and we've got a bad habit. So one of the challenges, Diane says, of healing emotional eating is giving up a habit that in some ways is helping you. In the Gain While You Lose class, I read this really great article by some doctors who worked at Kaiser Permanente years ago, who started learning about what goes on inside of patients who struggle with the disease of obesity. And they learned, and they didn't know, because doctors aren't trained, doctors are not trained to talk about sexual abuse, to talk about childhood trauma, and talk about these things. That's not what they do. But these doctors realized that for a lot of their patients, food was an emotional thing. It was an emotional thing, and it was tied to a lot of these traumatic things. So they were like, dang, a lot of doctors really don't know what's going on. They don't understand the disease of obesity other than the metabolic parts of it. So there's a lot more to it. There's a lot more to it. So here's what Diane says. When you feel overwhelmed by a strong emotion, and food is your sanctuary from all the inner chaos, and then you focus on the food, you're not focused on what bothered you in the first place. But then eating is a source of pain in itself, because now you're beating yourself up emotionally. Oh my God, I turned to food. I had this surgery and I'm going to regain weight, and I get upset with myself for eating. Now you're beating yourself up. That's going to get in the way of your healing too. So this, you can see, is a very, very complicated kind of things. That's why you need to learn to comfort yourself. You need to learn the skills of self-soothing. You need to learn the skills of not beating up on yourselves. You need to learn to meet the needs you had as a child, the emotional needs, yourself and with other people. Because when you learn to comfort yourself, when you learn to say, I'm angry, but I don't have to react with unhealthy anger. I'm frightened, but I don't have to lash out with food. I'm lonely, but I don't have to eat it away. I can do some other things and learn some skills. So we have to learn what's going on with us and then skills to deal with this as you learn to heal from emotional eating. And I'm going to wrap up today's part of this, and I'm going to continue on in the next podcast episode and finish up the review of this amazing book because it holds so much good information. So I'm going to wrap up with what Diane refers to as 5 differences between emotional hunger and physical hunger, because sometimes people don't really know. And she's adapted these, and I want to give credit where credit's due, because Diane even says she's adapted these traits from a book called Constant Craving: What Your Food Cravings Mean and How to Overcome Them, by Doreen Virtue, who's a PhD. So one of the things she says, emotional hunger occurs in response to your feelings. Hello, I want something to eat because I don't like how I'm feeling. She said, from feelings and trauma-based sensations in your body. So maybe you're feeling anxiety and you want to eat. Maybe you're feeling sadness or heaviness, depression, and you want to eat. Physical hunger, on the other hand, because your body needs fuel. You're starting to feel weak or lightheaded and you need something in your body, like your gas tank is empty. Secondly, she said emotional hunger tends to come on suddenly. Physical hunger comes on gradually. So if you've eaten, it's a couple of hours before your the tummy starts to growl, and you become aware that, I need to put some food in my body. Emotional hunger is like, I need something and I need something now. And that something is something specific usually. It's like, you might not even be aware of the emotion, but you're like, I need chocolate. I need it now. I need ice cream. I need potato chips. They're crunchy and I'm angry. So emotional hunger comes on suddenly. It's an impulse. It can feel sudden. It can feel intense. And it can feel like a craving. But physical hunger comes on kind of gradually as the food you've eaten has digested. With emotional hunger, you are craving certain foods. It is a craving. You're eating for emotional reasons. You want that specific thing that you've linked to calming yourself. And these are often high fat, sugary, or salty foods. You know this, right? But with physical hunger, you're like, I could go for a burger or a piece of salmon. It's not that big a deal. But emotional hunger is often about craving certain foods. And emotional hunger doesn't pay attention to signs of being full, physically full. But physical hunger, you stop eating when you're like, okay, I've had enough. That's enough. I'm full. I'm satisfied. Emotional hunger, it's like people say, well, I kept on eating even though I was full. Or it didn't matter that the whole thing was gone. I went and got more. So emotional eating doesn't pay attention to the fullness cues. And emotional eating often induces feelings of guilt and shame. Oh my God, why did I do that? Now I've set myself back. I'm such a loser. How will this ever go away? Am I ever going to get it? So there's that abuse cycle, that self-talk, that self-abuse that comes after it. But eating to satisfy yourself physically doesn't usually involve a whole lot of guilt or shame, especially if you've put healthy food in your body. So learning to identify whether you're emotionally hungry or physically hungry is part of this this process, this healing process. So I hope you're learning a lot. I hope that you are understanding a lot more about what happens with children when they are abused, neglected, shamed, bullied, all of those things that result in this, I'm going to get in there and fight them. I'm going to run away, the flight, the freeze. I'm just going to shut down. Or the fawning. I'm going to try to make it better, try to make it better, try to make it better. Those are the things that result in PTSD, post-traumatic stress, right? So when we get into next week's episode, we're going to talk about some of the practices that Diane uses that I think are so, so beautiful to use as you begin to work through learning to overcome emotional eating. And the reason I'm spending so much time again on this is because so many people are emotional eaters. And this is something that you've got to learn to deal with as best you can. You may never overcome it, and that's okay. But if you can make improvements, then you're going to be a lot better off. So thanks for spending the time with me. Thank you for indulging this topic because it affects so, so many of us. And I cannot wait to continue and highlight the rest of the book, Healing Emotional Eating for Trauma Survivors by Diane Petrella. All right, I'll see you next time, friends. Listen to this over and over and over again because it's full of info. Until then, remember, it's your health, which is your responsibility this day and every day. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.